The Weight of Water. January 17, 1945. The South China Sea. The water was black as oil under the moonless sky, churning with the debris of a shattered convoy. Wooden planks spiraled upward through the darkness, spinning like autumn leaves caught in an invisible wind. The cold pressed against skin with the insistence of iron, and the waves, those endless mathematical waves, rose and fell with a rhythm that promised nothing but exhaustion. Somewhere in that chaos, a young woman's fingers slipped from a floating crate. The ocean pulled her down with the patience of gravity itself. She did not scream. 23 years of imperial education had taught her that much. Women of Yamato did not scream when facing death. They accepted it with the same composure their brothers showed when diving their aircraft into enemy vessels. She had memorized the poems. She had learned the songs. She knew what was expected of a Japanese woman when the emperor's enemies surrounded her. The Americans would not capture her alive. The water would be her chrysanthemum throne. But then came the hands. Strong hands, foreign hands, lifting her toward a surface she no longer believed existed. American hands pulling a drowning Japanese civilian from the South China Sea as if her life possessed the same value as any other. And in that moment, suspended between the certainty of death and the impossibility of rescue, everything she had been taught about the nature of the universe began to crack like ice under spring sun. To understand the profound dissonance of that rescue, one must first comprehend the architecture of belief that defined Japanese civilian consciousness in the winter of 1945. For more than a decade, the citizens of Imperial Japan had been systematically prepared for a binary world, a universe divided between the divine nation of Yamato and the demonic chaos beyond its shores. The propaganda machine, refined through the ministries of education and information, had constructed an elaborate mythology around the Pacific War. Every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every classroom lesson reinforced a singular narrative. Japan fought not merely for territory or resources, but for civilization itself against barbarians who knew neither honor nor mercy. The characterization of American forces in Japanese wartime media descended into territories of Gothic imagination. Official publications depicted American soldiers as subhuman predators driven by base instincts, creatures who would torture prisoners, desecrate the dead, and commit unspeakable atrocities against women and children. The leaflets dropped over Japanese-controlled territories warned civilians that capture meant fates worse than death. Surrender equaled dishonor multiplied by suffering. This message saturated Japanese society so thoroughly that it became the water in which an entire generation swam, invisible because it was everywhere. By January 1945, this propaganda had calcified into absolute conviction. The American advance across the Pacific, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Leyte Gulf, was interpreted through the lens of this mythology. When Japanese civilians on Saipan threw themselves and their children from cliffsides rather than face American capture, they did so in the genuine belief that they were choosing mercy over horror. Mass suicides became acts of compassion. Death became protection. The hundreds of bodies floating in the waters off Marpi Point testified to the completeness of the propaganda's victory. The Japanese government had convinced its people that Americans were monsters, and monsters do not rescue drowning women. She had been a teacher in Osaka before the war expanded beyond recognition. Mathematics, primarily, the clean logic of numbers, the certainty of equations. Her students had been young girls preparing for lives as wives and mothers, learning the arithmetic of household management alongside the geometry of kimono folding. She remembered the classroom's familiar smell of chalk dust and rice paper, the afternoon light slanting through windows that overlooked a garden where cherry trees bloomed with religious punctuality each April. The war had seemed distant then, something happening in China, in places whose names appeared in newspapers but possessed no tangible reality. Her brother had been drafted. Her father spoke gravely of national duty during evening meals. But the mathematics continued, the students continued, The cherry blossoms continued their annual resurrection. Life possessed momentum. Inertia seemed more powerful than history. Then came the firebombs. She did not speak of that night, even to herself. Memory was a wound that refused to close. The sky turned orange, then red, then a white that burned the retinas. The wind created by the flames became a living thing, pulling oxygen from lungs, tearing people from their feet. She ran because her body ran, not because her mind made any decision. The city screamed with a sound that contained every human voice simultaneously. When dawn arrived, gray, ash-heavy, apocalyptic, she no longer recognized the geography of her own neighborhood. The school was gone. The garden was gone. The students were gone. The mathematics of fire had reduced everything to the same charcoal equation. The evacuation came weeks later. Civilians from the devastated cities were being relocated to territories still under Japanese control, or so the authorities claimed. She boarded the transport ship in Kobe with 300 other women, children, and elderly civilians. The vessel was a converted merchant freighter, its holds modified to accommodate human cargo with the same engineering consideration given to rice shipments. They sailed under military escort, part of a convoy carrying supplies and personnel southward towards Singapore and the resource-rich territories of the Dutch East Indies. No one spoke of defeat. The word did not exist in official vocabulary, but she could read the unspoken mathematics in the officers' faces, in the haste of the loading procedures, in the absence of young men. The empire was contracting, pulling inward, concentrating its strength. The Americans were coming. Everyone knew this. Everyone pretended not to know this. The torpedoes struck on their third day at sea. She remembered the sound, a muffled percussion that traveled through the hull like distant thunder, followed by the terrible groan of metal accepting its mortality. The ship listed immediately, tilting with the geometric inevitability she had once taught her students. 45 degrees meant a certain outcome. 60 degrees meant everyone in the hold's face drowning like rats in a flooding basement. She fought her way topside through corridors already ankle-deep in seawater, climbed past panicking passengers, emerged onto a deck transforming into an incline, a slide, a cliff. The lifeboats were gone. The escorts were gone. The ocean stretched to every horizon, empty and indifferent. She found a wooden crate, a chance discovery, meaningless as lottery, and clung to it as she entered the water. The cold struck with physical force, squeezing her chest, accelerating her heartbeat into arrhythmia. Around her, hundreds of people thrashed in the darkness. Their voices created a chorus of terror and prayer, but the ocean absorbed sound as efficiently as it absorbed bodies. One by one, the voices stopped. She lasted 6 hours, maybe 7. Time became fluid, unreliable. The waves developed personalities. Some were gentle, almost maternal, lifting her carefully before setting her down again. Others were violent, slapping her face with casual cruelty, stealing the crate from her grip before returning it with insulting generosity. Her hands went numb. Her legs stopped responding to commands. The cold moved inward, colonizing her organs with imperial thoroughness. She understood, with the mathematical certainty that had once defined her profession, that she was dying. And she was grateful. Death meant she would not fall into American hands. Death meant honor remained intact. Death meant the propaganda's promise would never be tested against reality. The ocean would take her before the monsters could. This consoled her as consciousness began to flicker like a candle in wind. Then came the light, harsh, electric, impossibly bright. It swept across the water in geometric arcs, a moving sun that transformed night into surgical theater. She turned her head, an action that required Herculean effort, and saw the vessel, a destroyer gray-hulled, flying the flag she had been taught to fear more than death itself. The stars and stripes, illuminated by the ship's own spotlights, impossible to mistake. American, the enemy, the demons wearing human faces. She tried to release the crate, tried to surrender to the depths before they could reach her, but her hands had frozen into claws around the wood. Her body, governed by survival instincts older than ideology, refused her mind's command. She remained floating, helpless, as a motor launch lowered from the destroyer's side. Remained floating as the launch approached, its engine coughing diesel fumes across the water. Remained floating as American sailors leaned over the gunwale, their faces shadowed by helmets, their intentions unknowable. The first hand that touched her was gentle. This confused her more than violence would have. She had prepared for brutality, had steeled herself for the horrors described in 1,000 propaganda pamphlets. Gentleness was not part of the script. The sailor, she could see his face now in the launch's work lights, impossibly young, impossibly concerned, spoke words she could not understand. But his tone carried meaning, soft, reassuring, the kind of voice one used with frightened children or wounded animals. They lifted her into the launch with practiced efficiency, wrapped her immediately in blankets that smelled of machine oil and tobacco. An American medic, she recognized the red cross on his helmet, began checking her vital signs with professional detachment. No one struck her. No one bound her hands. No one subjected her to the treatment that propaganda had promised with absolute certainty. Instead, they gave her water, hot coffee, a candy bar whose sweetness overwhelmed her senses, chocolate, real chocolate, richer and more abundant than anything she had tasted in 5 years of rationing and scarcity. The cognitive dissonance nearly broke her mind. She sat in the launch, wrapped in American blankets, drinking American coffee, surrounded by American sailors who treated her not as a demon to be destroyed but as a problem to be solved, a drowning woman requiring rescue, regardless of nationality or allegiance. Everything she knew about the universe required that this be impossible. Yet here she was. Here they were. The mathematics of hatred failing to produce their predicted results. The American destroyer USS Hazelwood had been conducting anti-submarine patrols in the South China Sea when its radar operators detected the torpedoed convoy. Standard procedure mandated caution. Approaching shipwreck sites meant potential submarine ambush. But Commander Walter Rodney Fenton made a decision that existed outside the strict parameters of naval doctrine. He ordered his vessel to investigate. He ordered rescue operations to commence immediately. When questioned later by superiors, he would state simply, "We saw people in the water. What else were we supposed to do?" This attitude, this reflexive humanitarianism, represented something the Japanese propaganda machine had fundamentally failed to predict. American military culture, for all its industrial violence and strategic ruthlessness, maintained a parallel tradition of humanitarian intervention that coexisted with war-making in paradoxical harmony. The same Navy that had incinerated Japanese cities with incendiary bombing also maintained elaborate search and rescue protocols for enemy survivors. The same military that fought with industrial efficiency also trained its personnel to administer first aid to captured enemies. American forces killed with systematic thoroughness. They also saved with systematic thoroughness. Both impulses emerged from the same cultural source. The Hazelwood's crew pulled 147 people from the water that night. 112 Japanese civilians, 21 Japanese merchant sailors, 14 Korean laborers who had been pressed into service by Japanese authorities. None were armed. None resisted. Most were too hypothermic to understand what was happening. The destroyer's sick bay was overwhelmed within an hour. Crew members surrendered their own bunks. The ship's galley worked through the night, preparing hot soup and rice. The cooks doing their best to approximate Japanese cuisine with American supplies, an improvised fusion cuisine born from emergency compassion. She woke in a bunk that smelled of strange detergent and strange tobacco. A blanket covered her, thick and heavy, marked with U.S. Navy stenciling. Her clothes had been removed. This terrified her until she saw they had been replaced with clean, dry clothing several sizes too large. An American sailor sat nearby, young enough to be one of her former students, reading a magazine with bored patience. When he noticed her stirring, he smiled, actually smiled, and called for the medic. The medical examination was professional, thorough, and conducted with a female Navy nurse present specifically to ensure propriety. Her hypothermia was severe but survivable. Her lungs showed signs of seawater inhalation. Minor abrasions covered her hands and arms. The nurse documented everything on a clipboard, speaking to her in English she could not comprehend, but the tone remained consistently warm, concerned, human. No interrogation, no threats, no violence. Just medical care delivered with the same systematic efficiency Americans apparently applied to everything, from warfare to rescue operations. The food arrived on a metal tray. White rice, not the mixed grain rations Japan had instituted years ago, but pure white rice, abundant white rice, rice so white it seemed wasteful, canned fish, fresh bread, another chocolate bar, an orange impossibly perfect, its skin unmarred by bruising or age. She stared at the orange for a full minute before touching it. Citrus fruit had become mythological in Japan, appearing in children's stockings only on the emperor's birthday, and even then only as fragments, quarters, eighths. This orange was whole, entire, given to a prisoner with the casualness of a discarded newspaper. She ate slowly, half expecting the food to be drugged or poisoned, but hunger overruled paranoia. Each bite tasted of impossible abundance. The bread was soft, actually soft, not the dense, chalky substitute bread Japan had been producing since wheat imports ceased. The chocolate dissolved on her tongue like edible wealth. The orange's juice ran down her chin with almost obscene sweetness. She had not eaten like this in 5 years. She had forgotten that eating could be anything other than the systematic consumption of adequate calories. This was pleasure. This was abundance. This was the enemy feeding her better than her own government had. The historical record contains limited direct testimony from Japanese civilians rescued by American forces during the Pacific War. Most interviews were conducted years or decades after the events, filtered through the reconstructive lens of memory, and shaped by post-war political reconciliation. But certain patterns emerge consistently across the documented cases. The theme of food appears again and again, assuming symbolic weight beyond mere sustenance. Lieutenant Commander John B. Ellis, serving aboard the destroyer USS Aulick during similar rescue operations in late 1944, recorded in his personal diary, "The Japanese survivors seem utterly bewildered by our treatment of them. One woman wept when we gave her a can of peaches, not from gratitude, from confusion, as if the existence of canned peaches in such abundance violated some fundamental law of nature she had been taught to accept." This was not accidental. American military logistics in the Pacific operated at a scale that appeared almost supernatural to observers from resource-starved Japan. The industrial capacity that had produced 50,000 aircraft in 1944 also produced endless streams of food, medicine, clothing, and comfort items. American soldiers ate fresh eggs for breakfast on remote Pacific islands. They received mail from home containing cookies baked by mothers in Kansas. They complained about the quality of their rations even as those same rations contained more calories, more variety, and more luxury items than most Japanese civilians had seen in years. She learned this gradually, through observation rather than explanation. The American sailors moved through their environment with a casualness that suggested abundance was normal, expected, unremarkable. They threw away half-eaten sandwiches. They left coffee unfinished in mugs. They traded cigarettes with the thoughtless generosity of people who knew more cigarettes would arrive tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Everything was disposable because everything was replaceable. This was not cruelty or wastefulness. This was simply how they lived. Americans existed in a state of material plenty, so complete they no longer noticed it. The propaganda had prepared her for American violence, but not for American abundance. Violence she could understand within the framework of war. But this careless wealth, this structural generosity, this system that fed its prisoners better than Japan fed its citizens, this cracked the ideological foundation she had built her understanding upon. If Americans were demons, why did they rescue drowning enemies? If American civilization was barbaric, why did it produce such overwhelming material comfort? The questions multiplied faster than she could suppress them. On the third day aboard the Hazelwood, she encountered another rescued Japanese civilian, an elderly man who had been a professor of English literature before the war. He spoke to her in rapid, desperate Japanese, his voice low to avoid American attention. "We have been lied to," he whispered. "Everything we were told lies. Look at them. Look at how they live. Look at how they treat us. These are not demons. These are just people, well-fed people." But acknowledging this required acknowledging something more devastating, that her students had died for lies, that her brother had sacrificed his life for lies, that the millions of Japanese casualties, civilian and military at home and abroad, had been spent in service of a mythology constructed by men who knew it was mythology. The government had known. The military leadership had known. They had always known. They had sent citizens to die, rather than admit the mathematics of the war no longer worked in Japan's favor. The anger arrived slowly, building like atmospheric pressure before a typhoon. Not at the Americans. They were simply playing their role in the historical drama, doing what militaries do. The anger focused inward, toward the leaders who had engineered this catastrophe, who had convinced an entire nation that surrender meant eternal dishonor while defeat meant only temporary shame. The difference was mathematical. Surrender killed pride. Defeat killed bodies. The government had chosen to sacrifice bodies rather than admit error. This realization poisoned everything she had once believed about duty, about honor, about the divine mission of Imperial Japan. The USS Hazelwood delivered its rescued passengers to an Allied processing center in Subic Bay, Philippines, on January 24, 1945. The facility had been established specifically to handle the increasing number of Japanese civilian detainees, men, women, and children who had been caught in the Pacific combat zones as the American advance rolled westward. The center was not a prison in the traditional sense. No walls enclosed it. No armed guards patrolled its perimeter. Internees were housed in weatherproof barracks, fed from the same supply chain that fed American troops, and provided with medical care that exceeded what most had received under Japanese administration. The International Red Cross maintained oversight, documenting conditions and interviewing detainees to ensure compliance with the Geneva Conventions. American military police provided security, but their primary function was protecting the internees from potential violence by Filipino civilians who harbored bitter memories of Japanese occupation. The irony was not lost on anyone. American soldiers standing between Japanese civilians and populations Japan had brutalized. The guards took this duty seriously. No attacks occurred under their watch. She was assigned to a women's barracks housing 40 internees. The building was clean, functional, equipped with electric lighting and running water, luxuries that had become increasingly rare in Japan itself as the war consumed everything. Each woman received a cot, a blanket, a change of clothing, and a small wooden footlocker for personal possessions. The possessions she owned could fit in one hand. A waterlogged photograph of her family, ruined beyond recognition, and the memory of mathematics she had once taught to girls who were now probably dead. The Americans attempted communication through interpreters, Nisei soldiers whose parents had immigrated from Japan to America decades earlier. These interpreters occupied a strange liminal space, ethnically Japanese but culturally American, speaking the language but not quite speaking the same language. They explained the rules of the camp with patient repetition: morning roll call, meal times, curfew, prohibited activities. But mostly they tried to convey a concept that seemed to have no direct translation. You are detained, not imprisoned. You are protected, not punished. The war is not your fault. This last statement caused more confusion than clarity. In Japanese military culture, surrender was shameful because it represented a failure of will. Soldiers were expected to die rather than accept defeat. Civilians were expected to die rather than burden the military with their protection. The entire social structure assumed that individuals bore responsibility for collective outcomes. Personal innocence was not a recognized category. Yet here were these Americans, these supposed demons, attempting to articulate a moral philosophy where civilians could exist outside the framework of national guilt. The food arrived 3 times daily, delivered by trucks that seemed to carry infinite supplies. Breakfast featured powdered eggs, canned bacon, bread with butter, coffee with real sugar. Lunch brought sandwiches, canned fruit, soup that tasted of beef stock and vegetables. Dinner included rice, meat, vegetables, and desserts, cakes, pies, puddings manufactured in distant American factories and shipped across thousands of miles of ocean to feed enemy civilians in a Philippine detention camp. The abundance was obscene. It was also undeniable. She watched the other internees struggle with the same cognitive dissonance. An elderly couple refused food for 2 days, convinced it was poisoned, until hunger overruled ideology. A young mother wept while feeding her children, overwhelmed by the realization they were eating better as American detainees than they had as free Japanese citizens. A Buddhist priest sat in the corner of the mess hall, staring at his tray of food, with an expression suggesting he was witnessing the end of the world, which, in a sense, he was. The world he had known was ending. The mythology was collapsing. The propaganda was revealed as elaborate theater. The camp administrators made no explicit attempt to deprogram or convert the detainees. They simply provided material comfort and waited for reality to do its work. And reality was relentless. Every meal was an argument against Japanese propaganda. Every medical treatment was evidence of American humanity. Every act of casual kindness undermined a decade of indoctrination. The Americans did not need to argue. They just needed to demonstrate. Mathematics did the rest. She began teaching again, informally in the barracks during long afternoons. Children needed education, structure, something to occupy minds that might otherwise dwell on trauma and loss. She taught arithmetic, geometry, the clean logic of numbers that existed independent of propaganda or politics. Mathematics was true in Japan and true in America. 2 plus 2 equaled 4 regardless of national allegiance. This universality comforted her. Some foundations remained solid even as everything else crumbled. But she also taught something else, something she never articulated explicitly but communicated through example and emphasis. She taught her students to question, to verify, to demand evidence before accepting claims. She taught them that authority could lie, that governments could mislead, that official truth was not always true truth. These lessons were subversive. They were also essential. She would not let another generation grow up as she had, educated into fantasy, prepared for a world that did not exist. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan intensified throughout the spring of 1945. From the detention camp in Subic Bay, the internees heard news through carefully controlled American broadcasts and through rumors that spread through the camp's informal networks. Tokyo was burning. Osaka was burning. Nagoya, Yokohama, Kobe, every major city was burning. The Americans were destroying the urban infrastructure of Japan with the same systematic efficiency they applied to everything else, from manufacturing to humanitarian aid. She listened to these reports with a numbness that frightened her. These were her cities burning, her country being destroyed, her people dying. She should feel grief, anger, patriotic rage. Instead, she felt only exhaustion. The propaganda had promised that Japanese spirit would overcome American materialism, that divine wind would protect the homeland, that the emperor's soldiers would fight to the last man. But spirit could not stop incendiary bombs. Divine wind could not shoot down B-29s. Fighting to the last man simply meant more men dying. The mathematics were cruel and inescapable. In April, the Americans invaded Okinawa. The radio broadcasts described fierce fighting, kamikaze attacks, civilian suicides. The internees listened in silence, each imagining family members, friends, former students caught in the destruction. The camp's emotional temperature dropped below freezing. People moved through daily routines like automatons, mechanically eating, sleeping, existing without really living. Depression became the air everyone breathed. Then came the food packages. In May, the Red Cross began distributing care packages to detainees, parcels containing not just necessities but luxuries, comfort items, small touches of civilization. Soap that actually smelled like flowers, toothpaste in metal tubes, writing paper and pencils, chocolate, candied fruit, small sewing kits, books in Japanese, somehow procured from somewhere, the titles carefully selected to be non-political, non-controversial, poetry collections, folk tales. A few novels by authors who had died before the war made everything complicated. She received a package containing Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice in Japanese translation. The incongruity almost made her laugh, a dark, bitter laugh that came from somewhere deep in her chest. Here she was, a Japanese civilian detained by American forces in a Philippine camp, reading an English novel translated into Japanese about marriage politics in early 19th century Britain. The layers of cultural transmission made her dizzy. Everything was connected to everything else. Nations were just lines on maps. People everywhere wanted the same things: safety, comfort, love, meaning. The book became her talisman. She read it 3 times in 2 months, absorbing Elizabeth Bennet's refusal to marry for convenience, her insistence on personal agency, her rejection of social pressure. These were not Japanese values. These were not American values. These were universal human values, articulated by a British woman 2 centuries ago and somehow transmitted across time and space to speak to a Japanese teacher in a detention camp during a global war. Literature transcended propaganda. Art transcended nationalism. These truths felt more solid than anything the government had ever told her. In July, the rumors began about some new weapon, something terrible, something unprecedented. The American guards seemed nervous, whispering among themselves, checking and rechecking their equipment as if preparing for something beyond normal military operations. The Japanese internees picked up on this anxiety and transmitted it through their own networks, amplifying and distorting it until rumors became prophecy. The Americans would kill them all. The Americans would send them back to Japan for a final invasion. The Americans had developed a weapon that would end the world. The speculation spiraled into paranoia. Then came August, August 6th, August 9th. The words themselves seemed to pulse with wrongness. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The American broadcasts were matter-of-fact, clinical, describing the atomic bombs in technical language that obscured the human cost. New weapon, tremendous power, strategic targets. The war would end soon. The camp fell silent, absolutely silent. Even the children stopped playing. Everyone understood, without needing confirmation, that something fundamental had changed. The mathematics of violence had been recalculated with a new constant. The equation now included a term representing the capacity to erase cities in single moments. Warfare had transcended its previous boundaries. The future arrived contaminated with radiation and existential dread. She sat on her cot, holding Pride and Prejudice, thinking about her students. Had they been in Hiroshima? Had any of them survived? The questions were mathematical, probability calculations about blast radiuses and casualty rates, but the answers were unbearable. She closed the book and placed it carefully in her footlocker, as if protecting it from contamination. Literature seemed suddenly fragile, irrelevant, a luxury the human species could no longer afford. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through radios across the camp. The internees gathered around the speakers, provided by Americans, broadcasting a Japanese emperor's surrender speech to Japanese civilians detained by the nation that had forced that surrender. The ironies accumulated into absurdity. The emperor spoke in formal court Japanese, his voice thin and distant, a god revealing his mortality through the static of radio technology. Japan was surrendering. The war was over. The fighting would cease. Citizens were instructed to endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable. The internees stood frozen, listening to their emperor command them to accept defeat. Some wept. Some stood rigid, faces blank with shock. Some smiled guilty, secret smiles that acknowledged relief. The war was over. They had survived. They would not die on an American bayonet as propaganda had promised. They would not commit suicide to avoid shame. They would live. They would go home. They would rebuild. The mathematics of survival suddenly became more important than the mathematics of honor. She felt nothing. The numbness was complete now, a protective shell insulating her from emotions too large to process. The war was over, but what did that mean? Her students were dead. Her school was ash. Her country was defeated, occupied, transformed into something unrecognizable. What did victory or defeat matter when everything was already lost? She stood among the other internees, silent, trying to feel something appropriate to the moment, but achieving only emptiness. The repatriation process began in September 1945 and continued through the following spring. Japanese civilians were transported back to their home islands aboard American vessels, the same navy that had bombed their cities now serving as a ferry service for enemy refugees. The journey took weeks, the ships deliberately traveling slowly to avoid straining their human cargo. The Americans provided food, medical care, and even entertainment. Movies projected onto sheets hung in cargo holds, the films carefully selected to be apolitical. Comedies mostly, Charlie Chaplin films, Mickey Mouse cartoons, universal humor that required no translation. She traveled aboard a transport ship converted to carry 1,500 passengers. The accommodations were basic but adequate, hammocks strung in former cargo spaces, communal meals served in shifts, strict schedules maintained to prevent chaos. The American crew treated their passengers with professional courtesy tinged with wariness. The war was over, but hatred did not evaporate with the signing of surrender documents. Both sides remained cautious, polite, maintaining careful distance. During the crossing, she stood on deck in the evenings, watching the Pacific slide past. This ocean had been her death. This ocean had been her salvation. The waters held thousands of bodies, Japanese and American, all of them equally dead, all of them equally irrelevant to the wave's eternal motion. The ocean did not care about nationalism or ideology or propaganda. It simply existed, following laws of physics that predated human civilization and would outlast it. She thought often of that night in January, the moment when American hands pulled her from the water. That moment had broken something fundamental in her worldview, a supporting pillar whose collapse had caused everything else to tumble after it. The Americans had not behaved as demons. They had behaved as humans, flawed, complex, capable of both terrible violence and unexpected mercy. This complexity was the truth propaganda had tried to eliminate. Reality was messy. Nations were not monolithic. Enemies were not evil incarnate. Understanding this felt like a form of maturity she had been actively prevented from achieving. The ship arrived in Yokohama in October 1945. The port was barely recognizable. Bombing had reduced the waterfront to rubble, the famous silk warehouses transformed into abstract sculptures of twisted metal and shattered concrete. American military personnel were everywhere, directing traffic, processing returnees, maintaining order with the bureaucratic efficiency that seemed to be their natural state. The internees filed down gangplanks and into a Japan that no longer existed, a country occupied by foreign soldiers, governed by foreign authority, its emperor reduced to constitutional figurehead, its military dissolved, its empire dismantled. She made her way back to Osaka through a landscape of destruction. The trains still ran. Americans had restored rail service with remarkable speed, but the view through the windows showed endless devastation. Cities reduced to fields of ash, factories gutted by fire, forests stripped by military harvesting. The war had consumed the country as thoroughly as it had consumed its people. Japan was simultaneously still there and completely gone, a ghost nation occupying the space where a nation used to be. Osaka was ruins. The school district where she had taught was flattened, no building standing higher than a single story. She walked through streets she no longer recognized, navigating by memory and occasional surviving landmarks, a stone gate here, a shrine foundation there. Her own neighborhood was ash. The house where she had grown up existed only as a rectangular depression in the earth, the outline visible but the structure vanished. No records survived indicating what had happened to her family. No neighbors remained to ask. She was alone in a city of ghosts. She found work with the occupation authorities, translating documents and serving as a liaison between American administrators and Japanese civilians. The Americans were rebuilding Japan according to their own specifications, importing democracy and capitalism, as if both were universal nutrients the country simply lacked. Japanese officials bowed and nodded and accepted these reforms with the same obedience they had once shown toward military authority. The capacity for submission remained constant even as the object of submission changed. But something was different. The occupation authorities encouraged criticism, debate, dissent, concepts that had been criminal during the war. Newspapers published multiple viewpoints. Politicians argued in public. Citizens wrote letters complaining about policy. This was democracy, messy and chaotic and inefficient, producing slow, negotiated progress instead of swift, decisive action. The Americans seemed to believe this was preferable. More importantly, they seemed willing to tolerate disagreement, even disagreement with their own policies. This tolerance was itself revolutionary. She watched Japanese society transform with the stunned recognition of someone witnessing metamorphosis. The militarist ideology evaporated like morning fog, replaced by what? American democracy, Japanese tradition, some hybrid form incorporating elements of both. Everything was uncertain, provisional, subject to revision. The certainty of the wartime years was gone. In its place came questions, complications, the acknowledgement that reality defied simple categorization. She began teaching again in 1947 in a school rebuilt with American aid funds, teaching students born during or after the war, children who would grow up in a Japan radically different from the one she had known. She taught mathematics, still the cleanest subject, still immune to political contamination. But she also taught her students to question, to verify, to trust evidence over authority. She taught them that governments could lie, that propaganda existed, that critical thinking was not rebellion but responsibility. These lessons felt like inoculation against future madness. The chocolate bars she had received from American sailors became a teaching tool, a symbol she returned to again and again. The enemy fed us, she told her students. They pulled us from the ocean and fed us chocolate. This was not because they were good or we were good. This was because their system produced abundance, and abundance allows mercy. Scarcity creates cruelty. Prosperity creates possibilities for kindness. Remember this. Build a prosperous country. Make mercy possible. The historical record contains one final documented reference to her story. In 1963, a visiting American journalist researching wartime rescue operations interviewed former internees at the Subic Bay detention camp. Among the interviewees was a now elderly teacher from Osaka who had been rescued from the South China Sea in January 1945. The journalist's notes, preserved in the archives of the New York Public Library, record her saying, "Americans did not understand what they did that night. They saw people drowning and pulled them out. This seemed natural to them, but for us it unmade the world. We had been told you were demons. Demons do not rescue enemies. Demons do not share chocolate. Demons do not treat captives with humanity. You destroyed our mythology more thoroughly than you destroyed our cities." This was both merciful and terrible. We had to rebuild everything: our cities, our government, our understanding of reality itself. All of it from ruins. All of it from the moment your hands lifted us from the water. The journalist asked if she felt grateful. She considered the question for a long moment before responding. "Gratitude is too simple. You saved my life, but you also destroyed the world I had been taught to believe in. You showed mercy, but your mercy revealed the cruelty of my own government's lies. I am grateful to be alive. I am angry I was lied to. I am relieved the war ended. I am grieving for everyone who died. I contain multitudes. This is what complexity feels like.